the only thing between you and a shitload of free beer, so I'm going to be very cognitive of that and timely. Yes, hurry, Russ, hurry. Hashtag hurry. I'm Russ McRee. I am the Director of Threat Intelligence and Engineering for Microsoft Online Services. I am, as a function of that, also intimately aware that today has been clearly questionable for some Microsoft products. Active Directory and PowerShell are clearly security hacker features now, so I get it. I'm with you. We use them in pen tests too. So there's that, and there's the beer problem. So we're going to move along very quickly. But one of the things that's cool about the work I do there, the work I do in the military, the work I do as a SANS handler, you're clear, hopefully, with the Internet Storm Center, and with, in particular, holisticinfosec.org, which is my site, I get to spend a lot of time on tools. That's my goal. And the mission behind those tools and their use is to inform readers of how to hopefully go take sometimes simple concepts, go apply them right away. So what you learned here tonight is something you can go do or may already be doing, but you'll thus potentially vary how you do it, the tools you do it with. Recognize that this is in essence a blue teaming primer. This is not necessarily highly scalable. It is in essence test data, but what we talk about tonight will be based on some realities, some truths. I'm going to basically pose things to you guys as questions so that I don't have to actually get myself in trouble by answering or saying anything terribly specific. So you'll see why when we get there. So on we go. C3CM is ultimately command control countermeasures, communications countermeasures. That is an acronym I picked up during officer candidate school. And so anybody who's been in the military and has spent time in any kind of schools, officer candidate school tends to be taught by sometimes older officers who can go on forever. So at about the 12th hour with no breaks, with a incredibly historied colonel, I was losing my mind, and I'm actually reading the back of the FM 102, which is Field Manual, Army Doctrine, Reference, Publications. Oh, thrilling, right? But in the back, we get this thing, C3CM. I'm like, that's a presentation waiting to happen. So here we are. A 3-part series on C3CM is available as of August 2013 at holisticinfosec.blogspot.com or .org. And in essence, it is 3 different write-ups on exactly what we'll talk about today, how to, in essence, conduct, identify, interrupt, and counter what might be an adversary on your network. Principally, it's not too terribly revealing, but as an aggregate of activities, it can be very interesting. We've applied it. I've applied it in a few different places. This conforms really nicely with what you guys may already know of as network security monitoring practices. If you guys are packet heads, you're blue teamers, you spend a lot of time with Snort, you spend a lot of time on the wire, you've probably read Richard Bailick's books. Practice of Network Security Monitoring is his latest, or Applied Network Security Monitoring that just came out from Chris Sanders. Both those books are heavily referenced in here and are really good reads, and this activity is in essence very much in keeping with that. So step 1, identify. In an environment like Microsoft Online Services as an example, full content, regular, timely, all the time on packet capture is not feasible. Snapshot on demand when you need it, sure. But typically, we have to use flows. Why flows? Who's a packet head? Who spends time on the wire? Why do you want to use NetFlow? Shorter, smaller, right? I mean, basically, you got source IP, destination IP, source port, destination port, sometimes, depending on the flow type, a little more data, but it's a much smaller footprint when you then manage it than it is a full capture. So what's cool about it is you can use tools that are freely available, easily installed on Linux systems. That's the other irony, is everything I talk about tonight is on Ubuntu systems. So fprobe does basically what a promiscuous listener would do for packet captures. Will translate traffic it intercepts into flows and forward it onto a collector, right? Very functional, very simple, very light, and incredibly useful, particularly in Linux environments. Again, you can stage these sensors anywhere. You can put listening devices, if you will, on spans, on port, or on taps. So, you know, the ability to scale this out is quite reasonable. There are, of course, tons and tons of commercial and expensive flow tools. So this isn't to say this is the only way you can do this activity, but if you don't have money, you don't have a big shop, you don't have budget, cool. This is one of the options that you can utilize. NF-dump is a tool set, if you will, not unlike TCP-dump, and its collection of useful tools like TCP replay. It's just the same concepts for flows. And again, really useful, very syntactically like TCP-dump tools, though. And then NFSend, which is basically a web-based, you know, graphical front end that simplifies viewing all this data, but allows modularity and plugins, and that is where NFSite comes in. And it's a flow processing tool that does a few things. Most importantly, it takes unidirectional flows, merges them, and makes sense of them as they traverse your network. Ingress and egress versus egress and ingress. Incredibly important as you're doing network security monitoring. You definitely need to differentiate direction and what's going on, and I will give you examples of why as we trail what is a somewhat made-up adversary in sort of real conditions that I can't really talk about at great length. But the plugin is incredibly useful for a visualization perspective. So, let's look at it. NFSend profiles the traffic, and as you guys look at this, you'll see a few things. Anybody who's spent a bunch of time on Glass looking at network traffic recognizes this is more or less kind of a bogus pattern, right? You know, there's all of a sudden there's no traffic, and then there's a huge, very flat traffic spike, and you're like, yeah, that doesn't look anything like what a real network would look like. Very good. This is a lab scenario. We're playing with the concept of simulating traffic. There are some wonderful NetFlow simulators, but what you get from this is the principal behaviors. These tools are built on the RRD tools scripts that are probably familiar with you, for you if you're using Cricket or MRTG. So similar concept. But as you zoom in, you see a few things that, you know, sort of jump out, but nothing too aggressive. So what if we dig in a little further? And right away, as you look at this view and sort it, obviously right at the top, what's the most important, interesting thing you see that jumps right out? You got a lot of SSH traffic, right? 4.9 gig, kind of heavy. That's not consistent with the rest of the traffic patterns, and it's obviously interesting. It's probably worth digging in a little bit more. So we do so. That's where NFSite comes in and is incredibly handy because it helps you sort traffic. Each of these entities is clickable. These views are unfortunately staggering, but if I drill into any one of these boxes, they'll pop out. It'll give me more data on the hits. And, of course, right away we see the fact that we've got some 22 traffic from the 70.40 address, but nothing that stands out or matches particularly that 4.9 gigs. So maybe that's cool. It's SSH traffic, and I'm clearly worried about it, so maybe I want to mark it, right? It allows me to tag. I can flag any given traffic and say, hey, maybe this is part of some exfiltration, something of interest, something I want to keep an eye on. And NFSite allows you to tag that and pop out an interesting view. But if I dig in a little bit further and I change my time window a little bit, then all of a sudden I can find that guy I was interested in. Here's a little more traffic, right? I've got 31.9.48.78. I don't have that many flows, but I've definitely got a little more data. Megs of data versus kilobytes. That's probably something more interesting, and I think I'm going to work on it. So, of course, anytime you have an IP of interest, you're going to look it up. I'm going to look up data on this one. Says, Syria. Now, if you're a large enterprise and seeing interesting traffic from Syria, what's the first thing you might think? Right? Syrian Electronic Army. They were really busy when we started doing this research, you know, late last year, and then all of a sudden in January 2014, those guys really got very aggressive, and while not similar to this scenario, it is public information that Microsoft had more than one run-in with the Syrian Electronic Army and did in fact suffer what was a compromise of social media accounts, if you will. So all of a sudden, we started tweeting out some very interesting things on behalf of very interesting people, not to our intent, of course. So, but it makes for a great pattern to analyze and continue down the path of imagining this as our adversary as we carry on through this activity. So NFSite now has NFIDS, which is incredibly cool from a visualization perspective, not only for detecting certain scanning types, but in particular really working well on denial of service and suspicious communications. And you can sort of see in a visualization, that's obviously either A, denial of service traffic, or potentially some individual single host scanning. It doesn't give us a lot of information around the actual specifics of source and dest IPs, but if you were to drill in and assign specific data points to it, the visualizations start to represent it more. So getting more flexible. There's a new release candidate of this tool as of 5 September. He hadn't updated it for years, but I've been bugging him incessantly. It's a guy named Robert Berthier, and he did drop new code. So if you guys want to play with this, just go see it on the SourceForge site. You can pull it down. I make this deck freely available, so if this is at all interesting to you, just hit me, drop me a card, and I'll email it to you. But it's just a hyperlink because it's an online presentation, but all the resources and all the information that you might find interesting are in the back of this. So phase 2, we have identified somebody we are obviously interested in that 31 dot address. So let's get into interruption and what that might look like. You've probably now heard a good deal about the ELK stack, Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. They used to be separate entities. Elasticsearch and Kibana, I think, were together in one company. They went out and bought the Logstash guy, and now it's one company that promotes these tools together. And they're incredibly useful, and they're growing in their use all the time. In fact, I'm right in the middle of writing up a full article for the Toolsmith column on HoneyDrive, and he's using Elasticsearch in the ELK stack for HoneyDrive data now too. So it's incredibly flexible, works really well in these circumstances, particularly with Bro. You may have spent a ton of time with Snort if you're a packet person, but if you haven't experimented with Bro and its capabilities, it is a true NSM, network security monitoring platform. And it's different than Snort. It doesn't bog down quite as much. It differentiates data differently. It dissects traffic differently. And it's pretty flexible. And it's very extensible, which is what we'll see here. And there you go. Adaptable, very efficient, flexible, excellent for forensics, allows in-depth analysis, allows individual query-centric parsing and logging, highly stateful, works really well in high-performant networks where you have to spend a great deal of time in massive traffic volumes. It's very performant. And, of course, it's broadly open source. It does not have any restrictions, so you can do with it what you will and extend it how you might. Elasticsearch is just a RESTful, text search engine, basically. It's incredibly useful, though. Very flat, very fast, very lean, and not... the issues with SOAP are obviously performance. Simple object access protocol individualizes entities and data, where the RESTful input is basically one API that aggregates everything for you much more quickly and efficiently. So that's what really makes Elasticsearch stand out. And then, of course, Logstash. If you spent a bunch of time with, albeit highly expensive, but at least partially useful, Splunk rocks, right? If you've got the money, if you've got the licensing that allows you to run a bunch of data through Splunk, but anybody who's spent time with Splunk recognizes how quickly you can overload the license, right? She's laughing, she's going, yep. Or God forbid you use Logger by ArcSight or something similar, very quickly you run into a licensing model that will limit you to no end. Logstash does not, but the payoff then is complexity of setup. You need to understand how to, in essence, configure Logstash to parse the appropriate logs. It does so inherently and natively for certain log types, but you may have one that is unique or someone custom that you wish to write to Logstash. You're going to have to work on that a little bit. It's not too brutal, but nonetheless, it is very flexible again, too. And then Kibana is the visualization component here, and incredibly attractive, very simplistic, not overloaded. It doesn't necessarily, overwhelm you with data in the view, and can be highly customized as well with specific query types to make the data useful to you as you're monitoring. And again, you have individuals with eyes on glass. So here's our adversary again. This is exactly the same IP we were talking about. And now that we've identified who and what we think the problem is, we probably want to move to doing something a little differently with them, potentially blocking them, doing something active, and keeping them out of our network space. The reality is, again, just Logstash by itself has a nice view, a nice query engine. It looks, again, not unlike Splunk. And you can see here we've got malformed SSH traffic specific based on timestamps to that IP. Cool, but not particularly attractive or comprehensive. And that's where Kibana comes in. And you'll note, as we zoom in, that on the far right in those little tabs, you've got the log types, and then you've got the IP address for that specific adversary. You can individually query and identify and make, interesting data pots specific to your adversaries. But what's cool here is that it also just parses out the bro logs. Bro writes its logs out specifically for connections, SSL, DNS, notices coming off of syslog, etc. But then two, the weird log. And the weird log is great because anything it doesn't necessarily have clean identification of, but still warrants being logged based on logic, will drop in the weird log. So that's definitely one that if you're running bro, you want to spend time parsing in some form or fashion. But you can tell, obviously, that in this test scenario, our most aggressive traffic is obviously coming from that 31 address, and we obviously want to dig in a little more. If you read Applied Network Security Monitoring, Chris Sanders, it's a Singress book, it's one of the ones I mentioned, you'll find lots and lots of references to Bro and Kibana and Logstash, and you'll also find on the website associated with it some really good scripts to do this activity with Security Onion. A lot of what I'm talking about here is just building this yourself on an Ubuntu instance. But if you want, NSM in a box, network security monitoring in a box, the single best resource in the universe, period, is Doug Burke's Security Onion. You download it, it's a distro, it's ready to go in minutes, highly performant, you can drop it anywhere and start grabbing evil traffic off the wire. The conflict for this activity in Security Onion is Security Onion's configured very specifically to do certain NSM activities. And as a function of it, if you add these tools, you may end up with contending or competing services trying to use the same ports, and you'll run into a bit of issues around interfaces, and you'll run into some complexity setting it up, which is why if you're just interested in learning and playing along as you develop with these tools, going from raw is often the easier way to go, with just straight up Ubuntu instance. So, but I will strongly recommend you spend some time with Security Onion if this activity is interesting to you. Whose is it? Blowing your camera away, sorry. Cool. Okay. Right on. So anybody familiar with Suricata? Kind of just a couple. So everybody knows what Snort is. Suricata is an engine created by OISF with funding from DoD and some other very interested, three-letter agencies for very, very high performance full content inspection. So Suricata basically can consume Snort rules, but does it with a different performance measurement than you might be used to with Snort. So very cool too, particularly when you think about Snort by definition being now in essence a largely commercial venture. So the beauty of Bro is the ability to do things like execute scripts and have after action based on detection. So if you want to run, something that says, hey, any hits for this guy, bang, send something to change an ACL or drop in a firewall rule or any number of possible action items, scripting out of Bro for action is really straightforward, well documented, and in essence, relatively easy to act on. So that's one of the true advantages between policy scripts and program execution. So very cool in that capacity. So lastly, all day we've seen some various folks, John Strand in this room just a couple hours ago, talking about how not to suck a pen test. That was great. So the Black Hills security guys, who are all patiently sitting in a row up there watching the boss, have written some incredibly good tools. And then we saw Tom sitting up here with Ben a couple rooms over talking about ball and chain. And Tom wrote, or he's also Landmaster, has written a couple of tools we'll talk about here in ADHD too. But you can download ADHD as a fully realized ISO as well and virtualize it too. The question you have to ask yourself is, what does active defense really mean in a context like C3CM when you've got, you've identified an adversary, you've made movement to interrupt them, and you feel like you may have them fairly contained, and now it's time to mess with them a little bit. And you feel strong and capable enough to do that. To what extent? There's lots of debate right now in military and three-letter agencies where, people want to talk about attacking back. And I will tell you that that's a gray area that gets a little fuzzy, particularly for corporate America. That's not something that, I'm in any position to advocate for or say that, we would ever do, because it's, in essence, illegal. Do with that what you will. Some folks freely and clearly pursue these avenues regardless. But one of the things you can do is, in essence, a passive active defense. You can confound, distract, cause painful loops, trap. There's all kinds of activities that you can perpetrate against your attacker that are not illegal, and that's the intent of ADHD and some other tools like it. So, great names. Honey Badger, Pushpin, WebBug Server, Decloak. They're all tools that help you identify your attacker, even if they're sort of trying to hide themselves in some form of obfuscation of their traffic or proxies. And then the likes of Artillery, which is, of all things, a trusted sec Dave Kennedy special. So here we are at DerbyCon. That's absolutely appropriate. It's a Python script that, in essence, not only runs honeypot-like features, but helps harden systems and provide a number of other services as you're administering and monitoring on your network. And you could stand up multiple Artillery instances. Ditto with Nova, but here's a catch with Nova. So it's literally just talking to Tom about some of the ADHD releases. I'm sorry, Tim Tomes. And Tim said, and Ben said, that Nova is now literally a commercial tool. So if you download their current instance of ADHD, it's the 0.5 beta, which we talk about here. It still works. If you try to go download it from the site now, they've moved on to a commercial model, so they're going to pull Nova out of ADHD in the next release. So keep that in mind. I literally just learned that down in the speaker room, unfortunately. But Web Labyrinth and then some others they're designed to disorient and confuse. Nova, in its currently available instance, is great because you can build what are, in essence, anti-reconnaissance haystacks. They call them haystacks, and the idea is, you're enticing your adversary to find the needle in the haystack. The beauty of haystacks is that you can set it up to look like, to an attacker who's crawling around your network, pretty much anything you want. So you want to look like you're a heavy Linux shop, because that's kind of what this guy's skill set looks like. He might be interested in Fine, or if he's interested in IIS sites, or WebSphere, or who knows what. But you've got some indicator of what he wants to play with. Build him a haystack. Draw him in and monitor everything he's doing. The beauty of Nova is the ability to not only prevent and detect, but then, even though it's basically an active defense tool, it too will log out. So if you're doing, security incident event management with some hugely expensive commercial platform, you can send syslog out to that platform as well and devise real-time monitoring and alerting specific to this anti-reconnaissance activity too. So in concert with your regular defensive tactics, it's pretty cool if you're, again, one of those blue teamers. So countering your adversary with Nova, you define the haystacks, and you can immediately, based on what they claim is machine learning algorithms, etc., begin to identify and profile your adversary. It's running HoneyD underneath, which, you know, if you know anything about HoneyD, it's cool. It's a great little honeypot, but it's a bit dated. So I'm imagining if they're offering this as a product, they've probably potentially made some changes. But log entries show clearly its ability to kill attempted connections from that very same adversary we've been talking about. So the 31 address is in essence being dropped, which is great. But we want to profile the traffic, flag it as a hostile event, classify it, and again, at this point, ultimately send it out in a well-formed, fully realized log format that, again, can be consumed by any number of different logging and monitoring resources. So basically, you identified, you interrupted, and now you're able to even, you know, kill and counter in full context. But there are other options here too, and one of these I love. I don't know how many, you know, if you're a website administrator, you're fully cognitive of how terribly most crawlers actually ignore robots.txt and pound your site anyway. Similar scenarios, when I'm a pen tester and I'm sweeping through your intranet looking for resources and compromising applications, etc., the first thing I'll do is ignore robots.txt and, you know, ultimately look for what you're trying to hide in that file. So that's a great opportunity, though, if somebody's crawling or spidering through your network to lay a few interesting pitfalls. And that's what Spider Trap, again, from Ethan Robish of Black Hills, to sort of confound crawlers into thinking they've found something interesting and then just trapping them in a perpetual loop. So as fast as the spidering hits that site, it just traps it and it just runs and runs and runs. I've tested this with Burp where I've just pointed it at a spider trap instance and then just came back the next morning and there it was, just blindly. In fact, I had forgotten to use the memory limiting startup for Burp, so it consumed memory because it's Java and it just sucked everything up, and, you know, in no time flat it was done, all thanks to this little script. You know, because in this case it basically thinks, hey, I found Etsy password because I must have been successful in some directory traversal, blah, 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 you know, and on and on and on it goes. So very cool from the perspective of just causing absolute mayhem to somebody who's sniffing around. Some of the others, again, we talked about artillery, but bear traps, open ports, and in so doing takes the information and can automatically blacklist. Decloak's kind of cool because it's basically a DNS server configuration that through a little JavaScript and a little Flash and its own DNS server basically gets right past any attempt to proxy or hide IPs and discloses them very quickly in the logs. And then Honeybadger uses, you know, lots of people like to share their location now as a feature in the web browser, and Honeybadger will make immediate use of that and find out who and where you actually are. So ADHD has a lot of fun. I was again told not, 30 minutes ago that a new release is pending and should be out pretty soon. They haven't updated it in a while, but the young man who's developing Ball and Chain, which some of you may have seen earlier, is now also the maintainer for ADHD. So pretty cool, and I'm hopeful. So that being said, I promised I'd zoom through this, and we'd move on to beer. So here we are. The resources are in there. Again, if you want the deck, if you find this activity at all interesting, the no starch guys are over in there somewhere. And they have the practice of network security monitoring. Highly recommended. Grab that book for sure. If you want the link to the deck, I will give you cards here. But beyond that, any questions before we depart for the evening? Sure. performance, right? I mean, one of the questions I get with this deck a lot is, what about software-defined networking or huge-scale networks? Use this as a principal guideline for the activity you may wish to conduct, but don't get narrowed down or limited in these are the only tools to do it with. You can do all of this with commercial tools, right? So, VMs, they get overloaded, you have to reset them. Java kills your memory. There's all kinds of interesting issues. But in, small, medium business networks, this set of sensors works really well, and the activity is actually, completely viable. Does it, cloud scale as configured here? Probably not, but there are other ways and means to do this. So. Collect and flush. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's, by design, depending on the hostility of the activity that you're collecting in a cloud environment, the flush cycle might be as fast as every 20 minutes. And that is absolutely viable. So yes, you bet. Sure. As an option, or direct by definition virtual connection to, in essence, a tap network. So a lot of times, you'll shunt traffic and split it off, and then multi-port tapping off to the side. And by definition, you can establish connectivity directly to that from either virtual NICs or real NICs, or you put a number of different host machines to top of rack switching that allows direct access back to the tap. There's a number of different means, but at the simplest, yes, basic host networking as specific to the virtual machines, the virtual switch can, in essence, be tapped off and monitored similarly. Not going to see that out, and that's an interesting scenario. You probably have to have a second listener in each sensor for intra-traffic. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's the watchers guy. Yeah, that's true. Yes, sir. I'd say not. I mean, you definitely want some Linux skills, no question. Well, Bro's inherent to Security Onion, right? So the trick is read the documentation. Doug's blog is, in essence, the documentation. He's done it's amazing what that man has both documented, captured, and taught about his own product. Between that and the fact that both those two books I've mentioned go to great lengths to help you. In fact, the practice of network security monitoring is in essence written around Security Onion. So get them copies of Security Onion, get them that book, and get them a couple of days, and they will be viably collecting if they position it properly. I really believe that. Absolutely. I've used it in defensive engagements where I know the network's hostile and I need to find the bad guy fast, and I've been able to do that in less than a day. So, no question. Yeah? Time for beer? Right on!